Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Susan Denser, Editor-in-Chief of Health Affairs, and I'm delighted to be the moderator this morning for this extremely important discussion on partnerships for global health success, Spotlight on USAID. Of course, this is the 50th anniversary of USAID, so a marvelous occasion to celebrate all of the achievements of the organization in the past and all the potential going forward. We want to thank, before we begin, the sponsors of today's events, who are the Global Health Technologies Coalition, IAVI, the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, PATH, a Catalyst for Global Health, Temptime, USAID, and of course, Research America. And I'm delighted to be a board member of Research America and that organization. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists today. Immediately here to my left is Wendy Taylor, Senior Advisor for Innovative Finance and Public-Private Partnerships of the Bureau of Global Health at USAID. Over on the far left is Emily Moore, Vice President for Business Development at Temptime Corporation. In between, we have Rick King, who's the Vice President of Vaccine Design at IAVI, and Hugh Chang, who's the Director of Special Initiatives at PATH. And so we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation this morning about the achievements in the public-private partnership realm under the aegis of USAID and all the organizations it has worked with. We very much want to involve all of you in the audience right here with us today, as well as those of you who are watching this on the webinar. So please feel free to send in your questions. We do want to make this as engaging a conversation today as possible. With that, we're going to turn to our first question and an opportunity for all of our participants to tell you more about their organizations and the roles that they have played as they've partnered with USAID in various global health initiatives. And as we know, USAID plays an extremely important and indeed unique role in funding global health R&D. It's a historic role now, stretching back a good part of those 50 years that the organization has been in existence. And we're going to turn first to you, Wendy. Tell us about the biggest successes, as you all reflect back on the 50th anniversary of the biggest successes in the global health R&D piece, and especially with respect to the partnerships that have evolved over that time.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to Research America for bringing us all together, focusing on this very important topic, and also for spotlighting USAID's role, because I think this is a role that has not been as well understood in all of what we do. And you did just mention we had our 50th birthday, 50th anniversary, and so we've been doing a lot of looking back on where we've come over the past 50 years. And actually, JFK created AID 50 years ago, and it was in an era of great scientific and technological innovation. It was during the space age, and there's a quote that he said, which I love, which he was talking about how when he was talking about foreign aid, he said the conquest of poverty is as difficult, if not more difficult, than the conquest of space. And I think that really highlights the kinds of challenges we faced. And despite these challenges, I think we really have been working since our inception to look for those game-changing innovations and those advancements where we can really try to find the ways to reduce poverty and improve the livelihoods of people throughout the world. And we have a history that has been built upon this strong belief in the power of science and technology and innovation, and it's one that we are really looking to boost now. So to get to your question in terms of examples, I mean, there's examples around smallpox eradication, where we made significant advances in smallpox funding eradication programs in Western and Central Africa that eventually then were adopted and picked up by the WHO and have led to eradication of smallpox. We've made significant investments in polio eradication in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've supported PATH, and Hugh can talk about this more, for the last 20 years through our health tech program, and led to a number of important advancements. So auto-disable syringe, which many of you may or may not know about, but there's importance to eliminate the practice and reuse of unsterilized needles. and also protect healthcare workers. And this auto-disable syringe that PATH developed and introduced allows for just a single use. And this is actually a really important advance. It's been we've immunized 5.4 billion people with this, and it's really the product that's used throughout the world now. Vaccine biomonitors, another important advance that came out of PATH. Where vaccines require careful storage for transportation. It's really important that they not get too hot. And PATH they actually adapted a technology that came out of the food industry to be able to determine if a vaccine, as it's getting transported, the temperature drops below a certain point, that vaccine is no longer good. So that has been helped ensure that potent vaccines are delivered to children. It's helped enable healthcare workers to be able to use vaccine vials that can contain more than one vaccine and make sure that those are still good. So in doing that, it actually eliminates wastage and actually has saved millions of dollars. So they've had all these important advances. Another one just to throw out quickly is oral rehydration solutions is also a big investment that we made back starting in the 60s and invested in research there, have invested in additional reformulations, invested in research that's now brought zinc in. This is a really important advancement for addressing diarrheal diseases. So we have a number of examples in the past have led to important advances. And as I mentioned before, our current administrator is really making an important emphasis on the need through our USAID Forward reforms to really reboost science and technology and innovation and infuse it in everything that we're doing at AID so it continues to drive all of our actions.
A really extraordinary set of initiatives. And many of these are ongoing, correct? You're involved in many of these now.
Yes, we are continuing to do more work in this area. And I do want to point out that President Obama actually just last year when he was at the UN General Assembly talked about the importance of innovation, and when he was talking about reaching our MDGs, and we've made significant progress against our MDGs,
which of course are the Millennium Development Goals.
But he said to reach the goals that we seek, to reach the make the progress that we're looking for, we need new innovations. We cannot simply rely on the tools and technologies we have today. So this work is ongoing. So we are continuing to invest in vaccines, investing in vaccines through IAVI. We're investing in vaccines through the Malaria Vaccine Initiative. We're investing in TB drugs through the TB Alliance. We're investing in microbicides. We had a huge advance just this last year in microbicides with 1% tenofovir gel, where we actually, for the first time, have solid evidence that a microbicide to actually enable a woman to protect herself against HIV and potentially other STDs. So a lot is going on. We're continuing to invest in diagnostics as well. So there's a lot of emphasis and work on new innovations. And I just want to say that the counter to that is also so important is making sure we're continuing to invest on the back end as well. It's not just about getting these innovations developed, but it's about making sure that we have the systems in place to be able to introduce them quickly and not have time lags from the point of development to when they're introduced in the developing world, but also that we can scale them up quickly and have the kind of uptake that's necessary to get to the public health impacts we desire.
Great. Again, just really extraordinary. So, Rick, tell us a little bit more about IAVI and pick up on some of Wendy's points about the vaccine development that IAVI has been engaged in and the partnership with USAID.
Sure. So, I mean, that was really amazing, actually, the breadth of what USAID is doing. I think it's extraordinary that USAID took the initiative to invest in not only kind of healthcare delivery challenges that are immediate, but long-term ones as well. I mean, developing a vaccine is a very long-term effort. It involves work that has to go on for sometimes for decades. And I think the commitment to recognizing the importance of health as a development issue and the long-term requirements of investment has just been extraordinary. And so IAVI's been an important part of that. You've been a great partner over the 15 years of IAVI's existence. So we're very pleased about that. So IAVI is, as I mentioned, just 15 years old now. We're committed to ensuring an HIV vaccine, make sure that occurs. It's a very challenging task. It's been extremely difficult. We're in a period now where we're very optimistic. There's new information that is developing, which I think has really galvanized the field for new efforts in vaccine discovery and development. And I'll tell you a little bit about those. But it's an extremely exciting time. And I think the efforts of USAID to work with IAVI to create a partnership model where we partner between different types of vaccine development people. We partner with academics, we partner with industry, we partner with our own staff in an NGO. We bring together a very different mix of people. I think that's an important component. We also have...
What do you mean when you say mix of people?
Well, you have people who are at the very early stages who are just trying to understand how the epidemic is working. What is the virus like? What is the actual cause of the disease? That's part of the work of IAVI. It's part of our partnership with USAID. And then you have people who are at the other end who are testing vaccines in humans in clinical trials. So it's a great mixture, and I think that the breadth of it is going to help us find a vaccine. We also have sort of north-south type partnerships. We conduct clinical trials in Africa. We have laboratories in Europe. We have laboratories in the United States. We're soon to open a research laboratory in India. So we have a global partnership across a large number of groups. And we have a scientifically diverse approach as well. We have folks who are focused very specifically on the antibodies that I can talk a little bit about as well. New discoveries that suggest that antibodies can be effective in binding the broad array of HIV viruses, as well as other types of vaccination strategies which elicit a different part of the immune system. So we have it's a broad group. We bring them together in IAVI with our USAID partners, and I think it's that unity which I think is the main success at this point. Just on a couple of technical levels, I think we all agree that USAID's mission and IAVI's mission is to focus on the developing world. And one of the key things there is to be able to test vaccines in those situations. And I think early on, many people were very skeptical about whether or not high-quality clinical trials could be conducted in Africa. And in fact, IAVI and others has shown that that's where they're best tested, actually. There's the great infrastructure now and partnerships between people in country and again in the developed world as well has made that really possible. So I think that's an important success. Another reason.
And what do you mean when you say best tested there?
Well, the epidemic is diverse. If we were to test vaccines only in the United States, we'd be testing them against a virus that's circulating primarily in the U.S. and Europe and the Caribbean. If we want to develop a vaccine in Africa, we need to test it in Africa because the epidemic is different there. That's one of the things that we've learned through the funding of USAID with IAVI. We understand the epidemic much better, the diversity of the epidemic, how different regions, how the viruses differ from one country to another. It's extremely important to know the epidemic if we're going to develop a vaccine because this particular disease is very diverse. It's not like even flu, which varies on a year-to-year basis. This varies on an individual-to-individual basis. So it's a very challenging thing, the clinical research has been an incredibly important component of that. Another area that has been a real success is that in partnership with USAID, IAVI's been willing to take on, I think, really challenging scientific problems. And I'll just mention two of them. One of them is to use really brand new technology to make vaccines called replicating vectors. Basically, we're trying to mimic as much as possible an infectious disease in a safe way with the vaccine. That's the way many vaccines work. We know that we can make effective vaccines in model systems against HIV-like diseases. And IAVI with USAID partnership has been incredibly important in that. And then just recently, publications on antibodies, which are able to bind the majority of circulating HIV strains, and now a number of them, is very exciting because most vaccines work through antibodies, and to date we've had few examples of where they can actually neutralize or block the broad breadth of the HIV epidemic. So we think that those discoveries and those findings are positioning the field now for a new generation of HIV vaccines, and build on the exciting RV144 work, which shows that vaccines can be effective. That's the trial that was conducted in Thailand that showed a limited but statistically significant protection. So those are really encouraging, and it's been the partnership with USAID that's been crucial for our organization and helping move the field in the right direction.
It's been a long road, but
suddenly
some real signs of success.
Yes.
I shouldn't say suddenly. It's been a long road.
It's been a long road, yeah.
Hugh, PATH also has an extraordinary tale to tell. Tell us more about PATH. Tell us in particular about some of the highlights of the recent era, and again, fold in how the partnership with USAID has been so instrumental in that.
Sure. Well, thank you. And, PATH has really enjoyed, as Wendy was referring to, a very long history with USAID. One of our portfolios, the health tech portfolio that Wendy referred to, has been a consistent source of support to PATH since 1987. So we've been working with USAID for almost 25 years now. That portfolio has really helped to generate a significant number of innovations. Wendy had referred to the solo shot, the auto-disable syringe, the vaccine vial monitors, which we developed with Temptime. It also was a significant source of the support for creating, essentially helping to create the point-of-care diagnostics industry in India through the use of these strip test diagnostics. PATH was able to, with the support of USAID, take the same technologies that are used for early pregnancy tests and create a set of reagents that allow those tests to be used for testing of malaria, of various STDs, and a number of different infectious diseases. In that particular partnership, one of the interesting aspects was we partnered not only with USAID, but also with the ICICI Bank in India to provide financing for the technology transfer of those technologies to Indian manufacturers. We also supported that technology transfer to manufacturers in Brazil, in Europe, and in Indonesia. And as a consequence, tens of millions of those tests are now being used today to be able to diagnose infectious diseases. I think one of the critical areas of the investment by USAID in organizations like PATH has been, as Wendy was indicating, not only in the investment in the research and development of the particular innovation, and certainly there have been a variety and continue to be a variety of those innovations that PATH is investing in. But PATH, one of the unique capabilities of PATH is that we are able to take those innovations and bring those into the public health systems in the developing world through our field programs and our ability to work with those local users. So as Rick was mentioning, it's really important to test these in that local context, to understand what training, for instance, healthcare workers have to be able to administer vaccines, or how they go about diagnosing disease states. And so the investment spans not only the development of the actual innovation, but all of the activities that are necessary to support the uptake of those innovations so that they can achieve their public health impact. I think in our relationship with Temptime, certainly much of the significant investment in the R&D was in the actual building of the vaccine vial monitors. But associated with that was a significant amount of work that PATH conducted with the World Health Organization, with UNICEF, to address procurement policies, to address the use of and requirement of the use of these labels on vaccines so that we could realize the benefits both in reduced wastage of vaccines as well as in potentially extending coverage of vaccines, because you knew now, by benefit of the vaccine vial monitors, when a vaccine was potent or when it was no longer good. So I think from PATH's perspective, success is not only in the actual development of the innovations, but also in the ability to take those innovations and actually help spur the uptake and delivery of those innovations into public health systems.
Emily, tell us more about these monitors and what it took to actually develop them, and give us a sense of how the partnership played out from your perspective at Temptime.
Sure, thank you very much. So just for those of you who don't know, Temptime is a privately held company. We're in Morris Plains, New Jersey, and we manufacture a variety of time temperature indicators, scientifically based technologies that can identify whether products have been temperature abused. And I think the whole story of Temptime really is a nice case study of the effectiveness of private and public partnerships and their impact on global health. If I take you back many, many years, Temptime it was then called Lifelines, had developed a technology, a very unique way of monitoring temperature that was proven, irreversible, miniaturized. And the goal of the scientists developing this was to deploy it to the food industry. The vision was to take this technology and use it for applications in food spoilage, to be able to detect food spoilage. And sort of meanwhile, in another part of the world, here was PATH and USAID that I had identified some issues in immunization programs. And the issues really were that vaccines, as Wendy mentioned and you mentioned, are temperature sensitive. If they're exposed to too much heat, they can be rendered ineffective. And if you immunize a child with a heat-abused vaccine, essentially you're leaving that child unprotected and they can contract a disease.
And we'll just make the additional point that there isn't a lot of refrigeration
Yes.
in a lot of the areas of the world where
Yes.
the vaccines have to be administered.
Exactly, Susan. And in fact, if you want to have a look around, we put some pictures up that show some of the immunization programs, the vaccination programs in action, and you can see some of the transportation methods, some of the challenges that exist in these countries. So really, both PATH and USAID identified that something needed to happen here to be able to, for the health worker to identify whether or not that vaccine had been temperature abused. And they wanted to be able to do that to protect children. They also wanted to make sure that vaccines that were perhaps exposed to a little bit of heat weren't discarded unnecessarily, because although vaccines are temperature sensitive, they can be exposed to some heat excursions and maintain their stability and their effectiveness. So the challenge really was, how do you protect children from receiving ineffective vaccine, but at the same time prevent wastage of vaccines that occurs when vaccine is suspected of being heat damaged, but in fact it is fine. So really it was the coming together of the technology that Temptime had with this need that resulted in the VVM, the Vaccine Vial Monitor. The application that Temptime was working on for the food industry was a perfect for the application in vaccines, but we just didn't know about it. We could make a miniaturized time temperature indicator that could be correlated to the specific heat stability of any vaccine. And after many years of development, you referenced this, it wasn't just Temptime developing the technology, it was also a lot of work from USAID and PATH in the field to understand how this technology could be deployed, make sure it could be used effectively, and once developed, geared up and scaled up. That's how the Vaccine Vial Monitor came into being. And I think the success of the of the technology sort of speaks for itself. PATH did a study back in 2006, and they identified that each year there are 23 million doses of vaccine that are discarded because they're identified as having been heat damaged, and so they're not given to a child. And then, in addition to that, there are 31 million doses of vaccine that are suspected of heat damage, but in fact are okay, and you can tell that by looking at the vaccine vial monitor. So those vaccines can now be saved and used, and of course, the more you can save vaccines in these programs, the greater your reach in terms of reaching additional children and making sure the programs are effective. And the technology, I think itself, also really helped to get to very remote areas. Sometimes to eradicate a disease, you need to get to very remote areas. You can't always do that if your way of distributing the vaccines is, okay, the ice is melted, I can no longer use the vaccine. Now you can take the vaccine into very remote areas. You've got the vaccine vial monitor that'll enable you to know, can I give the vaccine or not safely?
So this was really a match made in heaven, if you will. How did it come together? How did PATH connect with Temptime? How did you all know that this was even a potential?
Well, I think at the time that PATH was looking at different technologies to address this issue in the cold chain, there actually was a different technology that PATH had been working with to try and meet this need. And one of the things that we do sort of routinely is we scan the environment. We scan the environment of known technology providers. Because of some of the length of our relationships with various organizations, we actually hear about other technologies that are happening. So I think in this case, it was a case where we knew the kind of technology that we were looking for, and one of our scientists had heard about the efforts that were going on at Lifelines, the name of the company at the time, and started pursuing that relationship. But that's one of the benefits, actually, of the funding that PATH receives from USAID through this health tech program, is that we have a very strong partnership, and we have a lot of trust that has developed over the years as a consequence of that partnership. So USAID actually enables us to use the funding not to program a very specific thing, although there are times when that happens, but in the context of this particular program, we work together to try and identify what the area is that we want to try and address. And then PATH has a lot of freedom to try and find the right partners that fit the requirements in those areas.
What are the qualities that underlie these partnerships that are most important in bringing to the marketplace broadly the fruits of these combinations, Wendy? What do you think really makes a partnership fly?
Well, I think one of the things we've learned in partnerships is first and foremost, you need trust, you need communication among the partners, and I think that's it's first and foremost. But then you find ways where both of the partners really bring something unique and complementary to the table, and I think we've got some great examples of that, and where both are able to share risks and bringing about some sort of mutual impact and outcome. But they also, by bringing different things to the table, it's basically allowing you to get to your goal faster, because both partners might bring a piece of the solution, and so it's alone they might not be able to solve it, or they won't be able to get there as fast. But in the case of some of these product development partnerships, roles that PATH has played, you've got expertise in particular diseases, and really understanding the disease, understanding what's been tried before, understanding the developing world context, understanding how to conduct clinical trials in the developing world. And when you bring private sector partners to the table, they may not have that background. They may not know the specifics on a particular disease. They might not have experience conducting trials in the developing country. They don't have those networks. But they might have that know-how. They have the capabilities. They might have compounds. They have the technologies that could really be able to advance some products. And you need to be able to find ways to bring those pieces together. And I think we've got great examples of how that's moving things forward. And I think right now what we know is that today's global challenges, we can't solve these problems in isolation. We really requires a global collaborative effort, and these kinds of partnerships are essential to getting there.
Rick, what do you think, what would you say are the most important ingredients, and what has played out in the partnership between IAVI and USAID that suggests what is really most instrumental?
Well, you've touched on a lot of great themes in what you just said, Wendy. One of the things that I think that is very true is that a problem like making an HIV vaccine or a malaria vaccine or others as well, they're very big problems. They're actually beyond, I think, the capability of most organizations to tackle. And in fact, the organizations that might be best suited to that are, say, large pharmaceutical companies, and they're very nervous about getting into this. So we need to form the partnerships to bring together all the components that are necessary in order to make progress on something like an HIV vaccine. And I think what you really have to do is find the point where each partner sees a benefit in some ways for their own mission. I mean, for the IAVI mission of finding an HIV vaccine, pulling all these partnerships together is kind of obvious. For the USAID, it's a similar kind of motivation. But in order to find these broadly neutralizing antibodies that I mentioned earlier, we had to have volunteers in Africa. We had to have clinical trial sites in Africa that were collecting samples that allowed us to find those. We had to have the ability to ship materials and catalog them in London. That was a different component. And very importantly, we needed the expertise that was present in 2 biotech firms in the United States, very high-tech, small, in some cases struggling firms, to apply a very innovative technology which allowed those antibodies to be pulled out of the sample and isolated and studied. Notably, Theraclone Bioscience in Seattle was absolutely instrumental in the discovery of the antibodies. So, and they would never have invested in an HIV vaccine on their own. They don't have the resources. The commercial potential for a small company like that is understandably not part of their mission. But by pulling those groups together, and Monogram in San Francisco is another example, same sort of thing, where you pulled together people with key technology, and each party then benefits. In fact, because partly, I think, because the technology was demonstrated on an HIV vaccine initiative, the finding of broadly neutralizing antibodies, Theraclone Bioscience, not long after signed very big corporate partnerships with Pfizer on completely different programs. So I think it's having everyone see the interest. At the trial sites in Africa, it's about delivering health care.
Hugh, what would you say, from your experience, have been the key features of the partnerships that have really taken hold deeply?
Yeah, I think Rick hit on some very key themes. I mean, certainly you, as a partnership, need to have some shared goals that everybody believes in. But you also tend to have individual goals that are specific to each partner. And the most successful partnerships are the ones that allow you to achieve both sets, the shared goals as well as the individual goals that the individual partners have. For instance, in our partnership with Temptime, I would guess that in the early 90s, when I think we began our collaboration, that the folks at Temptime would not have thought, and clearly they had no idea of this potential market for immunizations. There's certainly a financial benefit to being able to take advantage of that market, but to get there, they really needed an organization like PATH that could serve as the broker to that global health community and the organizations that would be needed in order to drive the adoption of that. Mm-hmm. So while PATH's, one of the key goals for PATH was to enable healthcare workers to determine whether a vaccine had been exposed to too much heat or not. I think what this enabled on the Temptime side, and Emily will best be able to describe this, but was the development of a new business that helped to support some of the business goals that they have as a private company. So I think it's very important that you not only have a set of shared goals, but you recognize what the individual goals are, and you design your partnership to enable the achievement of those sets. The most successful partnerships are able to do that.
Emily, do you want to add to that?
I agree with what everyone said here. Very good comments. I think one thing from the perspective of private industry, one of the things that was really critical for us is this notion that Wendy touched on, the risk management. It's really critical for the company developing the technology to know that somebody really can specify what is the specifics of that technology, what is the need. PATH could do that. They could come back and tell us, and USAID could do that. This is the way the technology needs to perform. This is the size it needs to be. This is how it needs to work, so that we could focus our efforts on really honing the technology so it would fit those needs. And then the other piece on the risk management too is the deployment. So if on our own we had gone to develop this technology, we might have been able to make it successfully without that input, but then how were we going to ever get it adopted? And the fact that there were people on the ground who tested it, who worked with the people who ultimately would be using it and benefiting from it, that was absolutely critical. So it's a lot about how do you bring together these different goals so that you mitigate risk for everybody.
So a lot of people in this day and age will say, well, all of the private sector can do all of this by itself. There really isn't a need for either government investment or these kinds of partnerships. That why don't we just get the government out of the private sector's way, in effect? Would that have worked in this instance? Would you have gotten into this business in the first place?
You know, it's hard to say. I can say that who knows what would have happened over time, but we certainly hadn't seen the need. It would have been for our company, the size of our company at that time, to be able to identify the need, to be able to do all the work that would need to be done to go from concept to launch. It would have been unthinkable. It really wouldn't have happened. So I think in that case that absolutely the formation of these partnerships was critical.
I'd just like to build on that a little bit. I think at PATH we think about sort of this risk return model, right? And I think almost every commercial firm will go through that calculation. If they develop a particular product, what is the risk profile of that product and what's the return profile of that product?
And by risk we mean, is it going to fly in the marketplace? Is it going to sell? Is anybody going to buy it?
Right. What's the technology risk associated?
How long will it take?
How long will it take?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that having product development partnerships, for instance, as one model for addressing that risk-return ratio issue, is that using philanthropic capital, using the knowledge that organizations like PATH and IAVI have in the specific domains that we understand very well, we're able to help manage that risk profile and reduce the perceived risk that a private partner might have. A number of the small biotechs, for instance, I think Rick was mentioning Theraclone, they wouldn't necessarily think about embarking on a project of the scale that might be necessary. But if they know that they have a partner who can help them see where this can lead to and help provide resources, whether those are the resources on the ground to be able to acquire the antibodies to be screened, whether those are the resources, financial resources to help offset some of the R&D costs. The combination of those things helps to reduce the risk, which in turn then lowers the return hurdle that the company faces. So I think it's very important to think about how we can leverage both the assets that organizations like USAID have, the assets that organizations like PATH and IAVI have, in order to engage these very distinct assets that the private sector has and is best able to develop. It doesn't make any sense for the private sector to do it on their own often because they'll perceive the risk to be too high. And it doesn't make sense for governments or nonprofits to invest in the creation of those assets when those assets exist in great competency in the private sector. The key is trying to figure out how you combine those two things.
And I just want to build on that as well. And I think it's important to remember that for many of these products that are needed in the developing world, there isn't a robust market out there waiting for them. There's not a significant paying market. And so for companies, there's very little incentive. There's little commercial interest that they have in developing products where they have a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not anyone can even afford to buy them. And so Hugh has talked about, and Emily's talked about, really being able to reduce that risk, be able to help move development forward by infusing some capital, by bringing in that additional know-how that reduces that risk and reduces essentially the cost for companies to engage. So it makes it much more in their commercial interest to do so. And we'd seen in the absence of that, there really had been very little activity. And so you need those pieces coming together to propel a lot of this work. And we've seen so much of that happen in the last decade because there has been an infusion of support, much of it coming from the Gates Foundation. AID has certainly played a role. I think it's important to talk about how our other U.S. Government partners, NIH, DOD, also playing a very important role in investing in this innovation that's so critical to be able to help reduce that risk early on and help companies be able to see where there's some opportunities.
Great. We do want to open this up to questions or comments from those of you in the audience as well as those of you watching this on the web. So please, if you do have questions and you're out in cyberspace, send us those questions if you would. And again, if there are those in the audience who have a question or comment, please signal at any point along the way. We'd be happy to take that. So coming back to this issue then of the impact of all of this, both around the world as well as here in the United States. Obviously, I presume, Emily, Tempdyne has created some jobs here in the U.S. out of this whole investment. So there's been some real direct impact here in the U.S. Let's talk about that first. Let's talk about U.S. impact, and then we'll come back to the broader impact around the world.
Yeah, on U.S. impact, I think there's been impact both in terms of health programs here in the U.S. as well as business impact. By engaging in this, developing the vaccine vial monitor, over time, Tempdyne really began to understand a lot more about the issues in the cold chain, which was not really where our focus was in the pharmaceutical cold chain. Originally, it was in food. And so really, through the development of the vaccine vial monitor and this in-depth understanding of all of the issues that can occur when a pharmaceutical product is moved from a manufacturer to a patient, really helped us to realize that there was an unmet need in the marketplace, and we were able to develop technology platforms that would serve that need in the U.S. So for example, the same technology that is used on the vaccine vial monitor, has now been adapted to some applications for our U.S. troops. Meals ready to eat each contain a time temperature indicator that clearly signals if that meal has been exposed to too much heat and no longer should be eaten. It could make the soldier sick. There's also an application for the technology on rapid skin decontamination patches, which a soldier would use during a chemical warfare situation to clean off their skin. So here's an example of a technology that started for a very specific application and is now branched out to help people in the U.S. From the initial vaccine vial monitor development and our understanding of the unmet needs of the cold chain, we've also developed several other technologies that meet the needs in the U.S. So for example, freezing of vaccines in the U.S. is a critical issue, can be a critical issue. And we've developed some freeze indicator technology that was used on all the H1N1 vaccine that was distributed in 2009 and actually had the same kind of function, prevented that vaccine from somebody administering a vaccine that had been frozen and was no longer efficacious.
And in that case, it's too cold.
In that case, it's too cold.
Not,
it's the opposite
cold
problem.
Enough.
Yes. And the same with the Vaccines for Children's program, which is one of the big programs here in the U.S. for immunizing children. The freeze indicator technology is used on those vaccines, again, to make sure that children aren't vaccinated with inefficacious vaccine. Can also have the same impact of helping to reduce waste. From a perspective of kind of business, I'd say that one of the things that I feel very proud about is that we develop our technologies, make our technologies all in New Jersey. And so with the initial formation of this partnership that kind of launched the VVM, we were able to grow our company beyond that. We make everything in New Jersey. We ship it all over the world. The company is growing. So we've added jobs, and I guess in our own small way, we're helping the U.S. trade deficit as well by making everything here. So it's a good success story from a business perspective as well.
And can you take a stab at what the total sales have been that have been generated out of this effort?
Well, I can tell you that for VVMs, there's 400 million VVMs every year are deployed into the developing world.
So a big aspect of productive activity that
yes.
possibly would have happened without this investment, but quite possibly not.
Quite possibly not.
Quite possibly not. So, other examples of this, Wendy, that you're aware of, where?
Well, I think what's really interesting is even thinking about these reverse innovations and these innovations that are developed, starting off for developing world use, but ultimately could have applicability in the developing world. And I think we're seeing that with point-of-care diagnostics. It's a really interesting area where we might see these platform technologies created specifically to be used in low-resource settings, will work well in developing countries, but they certainly could be used here as well. And I think often innovation has been developed, certainly in the healthcare industry, with one of the goals being both impact, but also time to market. First to market is so important, and often cost considerations are not built into the design of these products at the front end. And when you're talking about products for the developing world, that is first and foremost. And I think PATH has really been a leader in thinking about how to make sure that products are designed with cost in mind at the front end. And
meaning that they have to be
low cost and super low cost to be able to be used in developing countries. And when we kind of think about that applicability here in the Western world, as we've got rising healthcare costs, I think there will be an increased demand for healthcare products that are lower cost and that can bring down the cost of healthcare. And I think that a lot of the work that's happening for products for the developing world may be pioneers in that front and may have further applicability. Now, that said, there are some technologies that are so low tech that they won't work here, but I think there's a lot of room for that, and it's an exciting new frontier that we may see more of in the coming years.
Rick, you mentioned a couple of examples of instances where companies, in effect, got into new lines of business, wouldn't have been willing to, couldn't even conceive of a way to get into the market or even to tolerate the risk. Can you mention some more examples of instances in which there's been direct domestic
Sure.
impact from some of what
Sure.
those companies have done?
So one of the things that IAVI does is make a principle of this effort, in a sense, is we do think, as I think all the panelists have said, is that some of the key technology, some of the key know-how for doing the difficult things that we want to do exists in the private sector, and it needs to somehow be unlocked. And so IAVI actually has an ongoing program where we, probably a little bit like PATH, where we survey the field on a continuous basis, particularly small biotechs where a lot of innovation is going on. And then we have the ability, in a very targeted sense, to form small relationships through an instrument that we call the Innovation Fund, which is basically designed to partner with small biotech and encourage them through that grant to apply their technology to the problem of our interest. This is something that is an important component of our relationship with the Gates Foundation, but it's really integral to the strategy of IAVI, so it fits within our USAID partnership as well. We know that out there in the pharmaceutical business and biotech, there are many technologies all along the chain which could be extremely valuable. So for example, just another example, I mentioned Monogram Biosciences. One of their core businesses is to test strains of HIV for resistance to therapeutic intervention. But the same kinds of technologies can be used to test for the ability of an antibody to block virus entry. So we worked with them to help develop those systems. They have this very sophisticated robotic mechanism where they can test hundreds of different strains of HIV, and so their technology benefited as an example of that. And we're constantly out there looking. We also have a relationship with not just biotech but big pharma as well. We're conducting clinical trials with GSK, for example. So one component of the vaccine that's in clinical trials comes from GSK. One part was developed within IAVI. So this is not part of the Innovation Fund, but it's a partnership nevertheless, an important one, and one which I think both parties want to see successful. And probably neither alone could have come up with a vaccine that has the potential of the one that's being tested. So it's really integral to our strategy.
And there's a lot of history here, even some of the vaccines that haven't panned out. A lot of progress was made by partnering with companies like Merck, for example.
Sure.
And for many, many years, there was
Absolutely.
a great hope that those particular vaccine strategies would reach fruition. We're not on the ones we're on now.
Right.
In part because or I should say, it was in part the failures of those that led us to where we are now.
And it's, this isn't something that IAVI is doing, but within the HIV vaccines area, Sanofi Pasteur has one of the components, very important component of the vaccine that was tested in Thailand and shows some efficacy, and I don't think would have considered doing that trial. So this is something which I think will be a component of the way we solve these difficult problems, where an organization and one single organization really can't take it on their own. Even the NIH, for example, can't take on problems on their own. As successful as they are in the biomedical area, they tend to partner with small companies. I was part of a small company that had a technology relationship with the Vaccine Research Center at the NIH. So these kinds of partnerships are, I think, underappreciated in how the U.S. can really take on these challenging things. I think to your question early on, if we just let the private sector do it, those resources wouldn't be unlocked. Those great resources in the private sector wouldn't be unlocked for these problems. It would just take forever. And I think that would be a shame.
Let's see, I think we have a question over here. And if you would introduce yourself by name and affiliation, that would be really helpful. Hold the mic just a little bit closer.
It may not be on.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay, very good. There we go. My name's Anika Wayman. I work at USAID in the Science and Technology Office. And I was just wondering if you could expand upon the role of universities in this partnership. A lot of these small biotech companies you talk about stem from university research. But if you could expand a little bit more about their role, how we can encourage more researchers to take their technologies and their work to more translational science, and thinking about product development and taking these technologies to more low-cost products.
Sure.
Hugh, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll give you an example of how we've engaged universities. First of all, in many of PATH also has a broad portfolio of vaccine development efforts. We often work with academic institutions there. But a specific example of a way that we're working with, for example, the University of Washington, is PATH received an NIH grant, actually, to establish a point-of-care diagnostics center that is focused on global health. It's one of 5 point-of-care diagnostics center grants that the NIH made. It's the only one focused on global health. The University of Washington has a set of technologies that they've developed with respect to microfluidics and various diagnostic technologies. And they are one of the key partners in our work with the Center for Point-of-Care Diagnostics. Another example, actually, is PATH is a member of it's called the Accelerated Vaccine Initiative Technical Assistance Consortium. It's a AVI TAC is what it's called. It provides a lot of the technical assistance to Gavi in their vaccine portfolio planning. And PATH, along with the CDC and Johns Hopkins, are the three key partners in that example. So we often work with academic institutions, both in very sort of hardcore basic science research, as well as in more applied research areas.
And to the point about translation and translational science being so critically important, you've got to get things from the bench to the bedside.
Right.
How do those partnerships with universities work in that context?
Sure, that's actually where we think PATH brings some of the greatest value, is because of our understanding of the use context for many of these technologies, because of our understanding of the health systems and the training that healthcare workers receive. We can do a lot to inform something we call the target product profile. It is sort of the feature set that is going to be required. It includes considerations for cost and affordability. It also includes considerations for how the user will interact with that particular intervention. And so when we work with the academic institutions, we think that's actually one of the biggest pieces of value that we bring, because most of the academic groups have not seen what a clinic looks like in a district hospital in Kenya, for instance. And that information, we think, is critical early on in the design phase to be able to ensure we're hitting the right targets.
Rick, do you want to add to that?
So I think it's a great question. It's something that IAVI also takes very seriously, because it is a source of, it's probably the place that most people think innovations come from, isn't it? You know, an academic scientist working. But what's quite interesting really is that, again, a small laboratory of maybe 5 or 10 people in a university can get to be kind of isolated. So the role that a group like PATH or IAVI can do is bring a number of those people together and focus on a bigger concept. And this is, again, I'll use the neutralizing antibody example of this. IAVI established quite a number of years ago now something called the Neutralizing Antibody Consortium, because it was an underexplored area of science. There were some people in academics that were working in that area, but there was some fragmentation to it. So initially IAVI pulled them together. They shared information, they shared reagents. There was a little bit of seed funding that was provided. And that actually leveraged the investment that the NIH would make in each one of these individual laboratories, bringing it together on this problem, and with the longer-term goal of the translational science. So in that case, we needed discoveries, and we still do, but IAVI is there as an engine to help have an outcome to this research. And now the investigators in this consortium are very excited about some of the ability to work with samples from the epidemic. So they've become very involved in studying protocols that have been conducted in Africa, and study how an HIV infection develops and the immune responses that the body makes to the HIV infection. So they've been sort of drawn into the field. They've been brought together. They've been focused on the translational science, and with some investment, but compared to the total investment that all these laboratories bring, both in terms of intellectual capital and also their grant support and so forth, it's I think been highly effective to do that. I think that's a key element to the way our organizations both need to work, because we're not big enough to do it all ourselves, obviously, but also one that's most productive.
So we've heard, Wendy, about a lot of work that these partnerships are able to do to sort of unlock activity and potential, really, in the university setting, in the commercial setting, et cetera. We heard a bit about jobs being created, new sales, entire new product lines opening up to companies. So just an extraordinary amount of achievement just in the U.S. alone by virtue of these partnerships aimed even at the global health sphere. That said, there's a lot of impact in the international sphere. 3 million immunizations a year, as I understand it, basically attributable to USAID financing, of course in partnership with many of the other organizations in the U.S. government. Let's talk some more about the impact on global health in the developing world in particular as a consequence of these partnerships.
And I mentioned some of our earlier successes, but I think this is really an area which gets to AID's true comparative advantage is helping get many of these products out into the field. And you mentioned vaccines. We've been investing in vaccines, made actually even a significant boost in our investment just this year in Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. And that Gavi has played such a critical role in ensuring that we can get the existing vaccines that we have now and have had for decades, and making sure that those vaccines are available to children in developing countries and are reaching the kind of furthest corners of the world. And Gavi's had tremendous impact. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the impact we've had even with our family planning efforts. And AID's investments in family planning innovations have really been a pioneer and brought many of the contraceptive and family planning technologies and approaches that are in widespread use throughout the world today have been largely fueled by some of the investments that we've made. So a lot of it has been done through these technologies and innovations. A lot of it also, we've achieved great impact also just through the interventions and how they're delivered and supporting service delivery approaches. So all of these pieces are critically important in terms of ensuring that these technologies get out into the field. It's not just the innovations, it's making sure that we have systems to deliver them. We have supporting the capacity of these healthcare workers, the capacity of the healthcare systems, the supply chains to get these products out to the people that need them. And then there's been work on even the demand side as well, because you have to make sure that these innovations, once they're out there, are actually valued. People see the potential. It's the ensuring that the governments that are making the investments in these technologies understand the value that they bring, so they prioritize the highest impact interventions. We need to make sure the individuals who are the users actually have the information they need to be able to make their own choices as they are making choices about health care for their families. And so the demand side is a critical piece of this as well.
Great.
Susan, one comment I'd like to make, and I'm sure everybody here will agree, is one of the things that has to be considered is the multiplier effect of these technologies. And if you just take the vaccine vial monitor as an example, used, originally intended to monitor heat exposure of vaccines. But what that really does over time is help with other health programs. There's been research done that says that if somebody contracts a vaccine-preventable disease, you're talking in a lot of these developing countries of a cost of treating that person ongoing about $55+ a year. If you think about, just take the country of India. There are over 360 million children between the age newborn and 14. If 5% of those children are immunized with the vaccine that's no longer efficacious, you're talking about over close to $1 billion a year in costs that are incurred that could have been prevented. So there's this multiplier sort of cascading effect of a lot of these technologies in health that people sometimes forget about, and I just wanted to make sure we mention that.
It's very helpful to have that mentioned. I want to take a question from the web, and then we'll come back to your question here. We have someone who's written in who I guess remains somewhat unconvinced that this has a lot of U.S. impact, so it gives us an opportunity to come back to that. But this questioner says, we're in the middle of an economic crisis in this country. What's the domestic impact of this work? What does this mean for Americans? Well, we heard in the case of Temptime, new lines of business for the company, new jobs in New Jersey. Let's talk some more about some specific examples of instances.
I can try to do something with that. One of the things that it hasn't really had an impact in terms of a product yet, but certainly in terms of the science, it's quite exciting that As you know, we all have to get a flu shot every year in order to prevent the flu that's circulating at that particular time. But by using very similar technologies and ideas that are being applied in the HIV field, and really were first applied in the HIV field to flu, a number of investigators are now quite optimistic that we might be able to identify a universal flu vaccine. And that would be a technology that would have both great health benefits. It's a major killer in this country. I think it's over 30,000 deaths a year due to influenza in this country. But it would also be just a great business. You would have a really breakthrough product that would be superior to the previous one, and there would be a major industry that grows up right around that. So that's a little bit in the future. Sorry, just to interrupt.
When we say universal flu vaccine, what we're talking about is
a vaccine that you would only have to take once, or perhaps every 10 years or something like that, the way you normally get a booster for tetanus, for example. I mean, instead of having to have a vaccine every year that is specifically designed against that strain that's circulating, we now know that the immune system can generate antibodies that bind most flu viruses. They're called broadly neutralizing antibodies against influenza. And while it's still far away, the potential of breakthrough products like that, they're kind of spin-off things that we heard about a little bit earlier, and they could turn into really major technologies. And that's a very big one. Research that's going on in the modulation of the immune system, how to control the immune system better in an HIV field, in HIV setting, could be used for cancer applications. So I think it goes beyond just the number of jobs created. It's about value creation, and much of the technology is being developed in this part of the world. So the benefits of the technology that's being invested in will accrue here.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about a universal flu vaccine that, as you say, might be able to be administered once every 10 years, that means think about all the vaccines that are now administered annually. Yeah. Think about the potential cost savings to the healthcare system of being able to just do that once as opposed to year by year by year.
And there are vaccines there are diseases that are important medical problems and costly to the medical system where we don't have vaccines yet. And the similar technologies that we're beginning to apply in the HIV, were pioneered in the HIV area, are also being applied in those, I'm thinking of respiratory syncytial virus, for example, something that most children get. It's kind of a nuisance, but it's a major problem for the elderly in this country. So there are technology advantages that will result in economic benefits, even at that kind of level as well. It's great if there are products that are being developed today, but there are investments that can be made that we'll benefit from in the future.
All right, let's come back to your
question.
Yeah,
I'm Arun Chokalaya. I'm the Director of Global Health at the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute at NIH. It's a terrific panel. Congratulations. The lessons learned from USAID and the AIDS initiative is fantastic. Now, when 2/3 of the world's deaths and disabilities are due to non-communicable diseases, such as heart disease, cancer, and diabetes and COPD, and we just had recently the UN high-level meeting which took place. Now, how can we extrapolate the success stories that you're telling us to the chronic disease prevention? And what are your thoughts in moving on those lines?
Who wants to take that on? Whether you want to start?
I'll start. It's a hugely important area, and we certainly are starting to see attention to that. We know that the disease burden from chronic diseases, as you've mentioned, is certainly a huge one on the developing world. And we also know that we have many technologies that have had a huge impact on those diseases here at home, and those technologies are not making it to the developing world. So I think it's a global challenge that we need to increasingly think about how we can take the lessons learned from, we've certainly seen the history of having these technologies, vaccines available in the U.S. and taking decades to make their way to the developing countries. And I think we need to be thinking about how to increase the opportunities and the channels for those products to make, for non-communicable disease products to make their way to developing countries. And we need to think about how to take what are some, in many cases, very expensive technologies and think about applying them in these contexts. It is not something that AID has taken on yet as a whole. We really are focused much more on the communicable diseases, and I think this is really the new frontier and a new challenge, and it's a new funding challenge too, because we know with the resources going in to global health, we're making progress, but we still have a long way to go. And as we start to kind of open up and think about how do you take on those additional non-communicable disease challenges, it's going to require a lot of creative thinking. And I think one of the things we really need to be thinking about is how to build the market incentives. And we haven't talked as much about that on this panel as well, but we need to think about how we can create market opportunities and boost the potential market opportunities for countries or for companies to think about how to extend these products into new markets. And certainly for emerging markets, these diseases are just as prevalent in India and many of the BRIC countries, and that's really the new frontier, which we've already seen the biopharmaceutical industry moving pretty aggressively toward serving these markets, and that's a great entree into the developing world as well, and we may actually see some innovation coming out of emerging market manufacturers to be able to develop some products that perhaps are lower cost and better adapted for developing world contexts that can also serve their own markets and serve these new markets. So no major answers here, but I think that really is one of the new frontiers and kind of the new added challenge that we need to be thinking about in the years to come.
Hugh, do you want to add something about Pat's sense now of the potential in non-communicable disease?
Sure. I mean, this is an area where we're just starting to look at. So as we have, our history is primarily in infectious diseases. We're beginning to look at how we could impact non-communicable diseases. I think there's some interesting lessons, though, from our work in infectious diseases that actually pretend some good things for non-communicable diseases. One is, as we've engaged the private sector in our work in infectious diseases, it has always been more challenging to engage the private sector for a disease that is primarily endemic in the developing world. Malaria is a good example. That there are no industrial world markets where there's a robust need for malaria interventions. There's the traveler's market, that's true, but in general, the dominant market is in low-income countries. The beauty of non-beauty, if you can call it that, of non-communicable diseases is that there's a strong dual market potential. And so, as I talked before about that risk-reward potential, there may be a little bit easier path to be able to reduce the risk to gain a reward level where we can engage the private sector in solutions for the developing world. I will say, though, that I think that it will require actually redesigning most of the current solutions in the industrial world. The industrial world is assumes a high resource environment. It assumes that patients can pay for the disposables that are part of their glucose tests. So I think there is a huge potential for engaging the private sector in similar types of partnerships. I think we'll have to redesign much of that technology to fit the low resource settings that exist in the developing world, but I think the market potential is huge. And the developed world, true. Actually, an interesting example, and this speaks to Wendy's sort of point about getting innovations from the emerging economies coming into the developing world is, and many of you may know about this, but Dr. Reddy's Labs has produced this, or is in the process of creating this, they call it a polypill. It is specifically to address cardiovascular disease. It is a single pill that combines a dose of a beta blocker, a statin, and a low dose of aspirin. And their goal is to be able to sell that very inexpensively in the developing world so that they can help address those issues. But they would sell it, they're looking and trying to figure out how to get through the FDA process, but to be able to sell that into the industrial world at a higher margin. But it's the same pill, and it provides those 3 medications in a single pill, hopefully making compliance much easier to achieve. So I think there's a huge potential.
I think we have another question here, and then we'll move to wrap up.
Thank you all for coming. It's a great panel, and thank you for organizing it. You had mentioned that, by the way, my name is Hemi Chopra. I am an independent consultant, Biomed T2 LLC, and I've met some of you in the past. Anyways, the question is, you all talked about technology scouts that you all have within your organizations who know exactly where the technologies are being developed. So for example, the first case, somebody, I think, knew the person at TempLife and you reached out. How can TempLife and others and universities and institutions reach you? So in other words, is there a point contact, I guess, at your respective places who gets a whole ton of technology descriptions, and then it goes through a triage? And the second very quick question, which I'm sure everybody might be dying to know, is how do you deal with intellectual property in the agreements that you all negotiate? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take that first. What's the portal that someone on the outside would go through either to contact USAID or IAVI or PATH, one of the partnership organizations?
Well, certainly for AID, where our Global Health Bureau is actually a pretty large, robust bureau with a lot of experts who are working in various areas. And so you have multiple points of entry, which sometimes can be a little bit confusing and hard to find where to go. But certainly feel free to, if you don't know those points of entries, feel free to come through my office, and we can try to help on that front and make sure you get to the right experts within the bureau.
And
Yeah,
Rick and
yeah,
you?
We're not such a big organization that it's difficult to get in the door. I could give you my email address, and that would make it very simple. But yeah, I think just make contact with one of our scientists. Really, anyway, is very easy. We have a website that helps direct attention appropriately. It's pretty straightforward, and we do have this outreach program, which tends to be, I think, very very helpful, because sometimes the individual doesn't even know that they have a technology that might be helpful. It's through that interaction where we find the overlap in value.
Hugh?
Yeah, so PATH has our website, www.path.org. And there are actually ways to be able to contact us if you have ideas that are listed on that website. In addition, we do have programs, for instance, the Point of Care Diagnostic Center that I mentioned. They do occasionally actually release calls for proposals. And so there are things like the diagnostics website that you can go to see whenever we have one of those proposals that we're looking for people to respond to.
And so let's come back to the intellectual property issues. So when any of your organizations achieves some kind of product that has been newly developed out of these partnership arrangements, who owns the intellectual property? How do we, to the degree, obviously, it's one thing to distribute these things at low cost or even potentially for free in the developing world. To the degree that they would have potential in the developed world and the margins could be much bigger, how are we going to adjudicate those gains in the long run?
Well, I think I would turn it over to our partners. In the case of the investments that we make, we usually are investing in partners who are, since we don't have labs of our own, we are not cooking up these technologies, and so it's through our partners that tend to negotiate these IP agreements and licensing arrangements. So I'll let you answer that.
So intellectual property is really important, and it's a great question and something that we pay close attention to for a variety of reasons. One is our mission is about the developing world, so we do have global access provisions that are part of any agreement that we sign, and they can be challenging sometimes if it's a critical technology that's owned by a university or a company. But it's something that
and just to explain, a global access provision
is basically that the company agrees to provide that technology as part of a vaccine, in our case, to the developing world at nominal costs, essentially. So that's part of it. Now, we also believe that strong intellectual property protection for the vaccines is likely to be a very good thing as well. And so we take very seriously protecting ideas and concepts that are either invented at IAVI or at one of our partners. And the reason for that is that in the end, we think that these vaccines are likely to have application not only in the developing world, but also in the developed world. And to have the intellectual property will provide the incentive to attract investment for both of those application sites. And so we think that an intellectual property strategy is crucial, and we have to think of it in kind of both of those fashions.
Thank you.
And I think PATH approaches it in a very similar way. We have global access provisions that we negotiate with our private sector partners. In all cases, the private sector partner retains control of the intellectual property, but what we do is negotiate the pricing, the supply commitments for enabling the delivery of that of the product that embodies that intellectual property into public health markets in the developing world. We have at times entered into agreements where we agree to tiered pricing so that even potentially in a developing world market that the global access provisions pertain to public health provision, but the company is free to set prices in the private sector in those countries on their own. This is in exchange for the contributions, whether those are the technical expertise that we provide to that partner or whether that's philanthropic capital. But like IAVI, we believe that their retention of that intellectual property is potentially critical for them to be able to raise additional funding to support that work. One thing that we do is retain what we call some rights to move forward with the intellectual property. If we ever get to a decision point where the partner, for some other reasons, decides not to pursue the project, we negotiate a clause that would allow us to use that intellectual property to pursue the original mission of that project. That is really a last resort clause. We've never had to invoke it, but we want to make sure that we're retaining the philanthropic purpose of the original investment.
So to sum up what we've heard today, we've heard that over the course of this 50-year history now of USAID, there have been just extraordinary investments in the global health arena through public-private partnerships in particular that have achieved some extremely important gains. And as we've heard, the reason to do this through public-private partnerships is, number one, these are some very big problems. No one's got a monopoly on how to have a new HIV vaccine. These are big problems. They have to bring to bear the resources that are in the university community, the private sector, the governmental sector, NIH, CDC, others. So these are big, big problems that need lots of partners, and that each of the partners can bring a piece of the solution together. And that's, as you all have said, been an extraordinary part of these partnerships. As you all have also pointed out, these partners sometimes have shared goals. They want to get to an HIV vaccine, they want to get to a malaria vaccine, what have you. They want to get immunizations delivered to children that have been temperature controlled. But they also have individual goals. Temptime wants to grow as a company. It wants to create jobs. It wants to develop new lines of business. And as you all have said, these partnerships are a way to address both those shared goals and also the individual goals. And as you also have all importantly said, these are risky propositions for many companies or many universities or others. You can't do this alone. You really need the collective wisdom of a group that is oriented around a common set of goals, as well as we've said, the individual goals. So the kinds of instances that you all have described where the partnership, whether it's PATH, whether it's IAVI, has helped a company to understand what it has to do to make a product work in the developing world, for example. Those kinds of risk management types of strategies have been extremely important. So as we've heard, these things have really taken off and really worked and achieved, again, some very important results. Again, as we heard from Emily before she had to leave, previously, just in terms of the vaccines that were having to be thrown out, it was on the order of 23 million vaccine doses a year that were, in essence, having to be tossed out because they were not being adequately temperature controlled. And now with the vaccine vial monitor, that problem is obviated. So some very, very tangible goals on the global health side, and as we heard, mirrored on the domestic side with new jobs, new lines of businesses, et cetera. So with that, let me just ask you all to close. A very smart person, Niels Bohr, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, once said, "Prediction is very hard, especially when it involves the future." So I'm going to ask you to take that hard road for a moment and just give me, each of you, a prediction of what you think we might see over the next 5 to 10 years coming down the road as some of these partnerships really continue to rise to meet some of these global health challenges. And Hugh, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Well, we at PATH certainly hope that in the next 5 to 10 years you'll actually see the release of the first malaria vaccine that PATH has been working with GSK through the support of USAID and the foundation to release. We had some encouraging initial results from the phase 3 study that were released just this last October. And I think, importantly, there are a lot of these, I'll call them complementary innovations, things like the vaccine vial monitors, things like the auto-disable syringe. One example of a current grant that we have from USAID is to help develop, it's called a balloon tamponade, and it's basically a device that can help to address postpartum hemorrhage, which is one of the largest causes of maternal death. And it has a lot of promise to be able to address that issue. So I think you'll see some of these smaller innovations as well advance over the next 5 years.
Rick?
Well, so I'm going to be first negative and then positive. I fear the next 5 years, and it comes partly from the question that, or the tone of the question that came in on your from the internet, and that is that maybe people won't understand the long-term and consistent follow-through that's necessary to take on difficult challenges, and we might fall back. There are spectacular examples of that in the past. Malaria control efforts was one that was a spectacular situation where the follow-through didn't quite make it, and malaria resurfaced in most of the world, actually. So I worry about that, and I hope that, and especially in the next few years, we'll have the wisdom to recognize that persistence is going to be our most important attribute in facing the incredible challenges, whether they're HIV or TB or even measles vaccination for that matter, frankly, something that's very tangible. So that I'll turn now to be positive. And in the HIV space, I think we can be very optimistic, not that an HIV vaccine will be available, because it won't. In 5 years, that's just too fast a time. But what we will have in the next 5 years is a new generation of vaccines and a much better understanding of how they might work so that we can follow them. That's what the field is doing now. The field is finding out how RV144 might have worked in Thailand and is ready to follow up on that in a very big way. And at the level that I mentioned earlier, we have vaccines that we know are doing great things in the animal models. They're controlling disease in the animal models. They're preventing infection in the animal models. And we need to turn those into human vaccines. And you'll see that. You'll see those vaccines being tried out in people. And the combination of the two things, understanding how something works, so that when you put a new vaccine into people, you can see whether it's doing those critical things, I think will give us a lot more confidence. So I'm very hopeful that if we have that persistence, in 5 years' time, we'll see the feasibility of an HIV vaccine.
Okay, and Wendy, you get the last word on the prediction realm.
Okay, and I think Rick brought up a very, very important point, and we are certainly in an era of increasingly constrained budget resources, and we certainly, we have made tremendous gains against child mortality and seen dramatic reductions in child mortality. We've seen reductions in maternal mortality. We've seen investments through the President's Malaria Initiative bringing rates of malaria down significantly, because we know we have many of the tools we need to be able to bring malaria deaths to a near zero, which we're looking for by 2015. Investments through PEPFAR have really been able to enable many of the life-saving technologies for HIV drugs to get out to the people that need them. And so we have all of these gains. We certainly have to make sure that those gains aren't lost in the coming years as we face tighter and tighter constraints. So I think that puts the pressure on us even more to think about how to do more with less, and that will be a recurring theme that we will constantly challenge us to make sure that we have the backbone to continue to make those long-term investments. We continue to push forward to ensure that we are doing the best we can with the resources we have in the field, and we're being as smart as we can with every dollar. And one of the things that we've been focusing on is we've been looking to make those investments. One thing that I didn't mention, and Hugh picked up on the maternal and neonatal health. We actually have been issuing a series of grand challenges for development. And we issued one which I was intimately involved with, was our Saving Lives at Birth program. We're really looking for those game-changing innovations that not just help us make those incremental steps forward, but help us make those big transformational leaps. And so part of making investments is actually being comfortable with making bets on those ideas that really could take us many leaps forward. And that, I think, is being smart with our scarce resources. We have to be able to make those bets that are going to help us make those bigger leaps and get to where we need to go faster. So big challenges ahead for us, but a tremendous potential to have continued gains against child mortality, continued gains against HIV, continued gains against malaria, many of these areas where we really are poised to be able to see huge impacts in the coming years ahead.
Well, speaking of having to do more with less, we have to end this now because we are out of time. I wish we could do more because, as you all have set before us today, I think a number of really important examples of what has already been accomplished, as well as the extraordinary potential ahead. So thanks to all three of you for a really terrific discussion, and thanks to those of you in the audience for being with us today as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you.